This is a follow-up to my video on how to get 3 times the growth on Patreon. I posted that video in March of 2017, and since then I've received a lot of requests to create a follow-up video like this. A lot of viewers were curious why I didn't achieve my prediction of reaching 3,000 a month by around August or October of 2018. I was only able to reach $2,627 by August 2018, but considering I made my prediction in March 2017, when I was only at around $1,564, that wasn't a bad guess. But as you can see, just as I was reaching the growth I had expected, a plateau wiped out my growth for about a year. By August 2019, I had gone from $2,627 to only $2,792 a month. Now currently we're looking at pledge growth, which shows the total pledged versus pledges that were canceled. It's a slightly different number than the actual income I earned before taxes each month, but it still shows the overall trend of growth. Unfortunately, in October of 2019, my data got messed up by someone who was trying to make a $500 pledge that got declined, so I've edited this chart to remove that $500 discrepancy. Fortunately, this error is not present in my earnings analytics. It's not quite the same data, but it still shows the growth and plateaus. Now, I don't know for certain what caused the plateau, but I do have some ideas. First, I made a lot of changes in 2018 and 2019 to my Patreon. So what were some of those changes? Well, I made changes to optimize my productivity, which made my workday easier by eliminating or automating recurring tasks each month. So for example, I discontinued or maybe even updated rewards that were too demanding or had little return on investment. In doing that, I gave myself more time to invest in rewards that are valuable to most of my patrons. Now there was a con to making that change, and that is that it caused upheaval. It upset long-term patrons who were used to getting those rewards that I had changed. Another change that I made is that I got bogged down while producing in-depth courses, and I didn't publish as much on Patreon. There were pros to doing that, and that was that I made a lot of income from course sales, and many of those sales I can attribute to purchases from my patrons. These courses ultimately benefited patrons, and without their pre-orders for the courses, I might not have been able to commit to creating such in-depth content. The downside to making this change is that it was a turnoff for first-time patrons who were expecting more engagement from me. This caused a trend of higher monthly turnaround. So I can give you an idea of what I mean by that by going back to my pledge growth chart. And here we can see all these green bars are new and increased pledges. The red bars next to them are canceled or decreased pledges. So if we look around this period of growth here, we can see that there's a lot more green and not as much red. There's usually more green than red. That means that I'm growing and I'm not losing a lot of patrons each month. But when we get to this period here where I'm kind of changing stuff a lot, it starts to get a little more out of balance. There are some months here where I have more patrons leaving than I have patrons joining each month. Or in other words, I've made some changes and there's some people that aren't happy with that, or the changes I made are somehow causing people not to stick around as long. Another change I made is that near the end of that period of growth is when I stopped offering some high-value rewards that were too much for me to handle each month. The pros to this decision were that I reduced my stress and anxiety, and to me, that's really important. I was getting way too stressed out trying to be able to fulfill rewards each month, and I was honestly in over my head. This gave me more time to focus on benefits that are more reasonable to fulfill. Now, of course, there was a con for that decision, and that was that patrons were disappointed that I had created a reward and then taken it away. So those are my guesses as to why my Patreon growth has stalled, but it very well could be that I'm just experiencing a natural plateau, and all of the changes I made had little or no impact on my growth. But based on patron exit polls, I know for a fact that some of the changes I made resulted in canceled pledges. Not many, but even a few each month can really slow down your growth. So how could I have maintained my growth? I may have been able to maintain some of the growth I had by making fewer changes, but that would have involved stretching myself too thin creatively. There's a balance between experiencing growth and how much work you can handle long term. So the point of my original video isn't that I made a prediction and didn't achieve it within the time frame that I estimated. It's that by identifying your sources of growth or lack of growth, you can use those observations to gain traction and get out of a slump. Slumps aren't a one-time occurrence. You're going to have ups and downs in your career. on Patreon or with anything. The point is that you have to be proactive in order to be able to get out of a slump, and sometimes that takes thinking about what you're doing and being a little bit more introspective. You can sit down just like I did and look at the data, look at the analytics on Patreon, look at the things that you're posting elsewhere and kind of piece things together and go, okay, this is what I did when I made these changes. This is the effect it had, and was that good or bad? So this time around, I won't be making a prediction about where I'll be in a year because I don't know what 2020 and 2021 have in store for me. It certainly does appear like I'm back on an upward trend, but it's hard to say if I'll plateau again and when. I have recently moved some video-based rewards to YouTube memberships for convenience sake, so I have had some patrons switch over to the YouTube platform. Naturally, that's caused some confusion, and it'll likely disrupt things a bit until people become more comfortable with the multiple membership platforms that I create content for. The growth of my YouTube memberships itself will also take away from some of the growth I might expect to receive on Patreon in the coming years. Again, these are all choices that I made to streamline things on my end. It's a gamble, but I'm hoping that the benefits outweigh the consequences of making a change to the structure of my memberships. To me, it's worth it not to stress out as much each month over fulfilling benefits. So how do I plan to overcome the plateau? Last year, I started branching out to create content for Photoshop and Fresco users. This will expand the pool of potential patrons beyond my current niche of Corel Painter. I'm also going to have to work on stopping the bleeding. I need to try to remedy the reasons why patrons are leaving in the first place. And I know what all those reasons are because I have my Patreon exit surveys. One of the major reasons is patrons can't find their rewards, or Patreon is too confusing. And it's on you as the creator to make it as easy as possible to find the content that you're offering. But Patreon does not make that easy for you. It's definitely not the best website for managing a lot of content. I lose a lot of patrons each month because they cannot find their benefits, despite providing links in direct messages, on a page on my website, in a video tutorial, on the main overview of my Patreon, in a welcome message after they sign up, in a pinned post, and in featured tags. There's just something about the Patreon website that is not easy to use for my patrons, and I'm not the only creator that experiences this. Patreon has also been making some changes to their website to hopefully make the website easier to use for patrons, and I'm hoping that this will continue and Patreon will add some better ways to organize the type of content that I offer. Another common answer in my patron exit polls are that the patron got the reward they signed up for and then canceled. Really, the best thing you can do here is encourage your patrons to stick around rather than just pledge once to get a one-time reward. For example, you could offer limited time benefits that expire each month. Another reason why I'm losing patrons is because I'm not engaging enough. And this one is tricky because I post content several times every month, yet some of my patrons feel like I'm not posting enough, but when I've done polls, I also know that there's a lot of patrons who don't want me to post too much. So I don't want to bother people by posting just for the sake of posting rather than focusing on quality content. I think in this case, if it's not your fault for missing your fulfillments and not posting at least once a month, then you just have to chalk up those losses as folks who had the wrong impression of what you offer. And going forward, just try to make it more clear about what you offer on your Patreon. Now, one of the most common exit polls is, I only intended to support you for a limited time, or my financial situation changed. A lot of folks just want to support me for a short time, and that's totally cool with me. I'm fine with that being one of the most common reasons that people stop pledging to me, and I really have no control over that other than to try to help artists find financial success through my lessons and resources. Another reason why patrons are canceling their pledges is because they're not happy with the rewards offered on Patreon. This is a consequence of making changes, and I don't really know that there's much of a remedy for it. However, I don't want you to fear making changes if it's for your own well-being. If you're feeling overworked, you absolutely deserve to move benefits to a higher tier. If there are benefits you feel you can no longer offer, then scrap them. As long as you're open about the changes you're making, then your patrons are going to understand. Your core fans are going to support you because they want to, not to get a reward. You can't please everyone, and you'll lose patrons when you make changes, but hopefully the core of your community will stick with you because they want you to keep creating content. You absolutely should be appreciative of any level of patronage, but it doesn't mean that you shouldn't try to grow. The best you can do here is just try to focus on making changes slowly and carefully. Don't be afraid to test the waters in a post and get feedback from your patrons before making a major change. In my case, I paid the price for getting in over my head. I didn't think ahead about how much effort would be involved and whether or not I'd always be able to fulfill those benefits that I created. In other cases, the benefits were being underutilized by my patrons, and it just wasn't worth the time to create those rewards each month. I try to be smarter about it now, and I use polls to gauge demand for new benefit ideas. Yet another cause of patron dissatisfaction is Patreon's own billing cycle. Patrons are billed on the first of the month, so there's a higher turnaround rate on the first of the month because patrons signed up near the end of the month, and then they get billed again the very next day or then the next couple of days, and they feel like they're getting charged twice. You can try to let people know that that's going to happen up front, but they may not always get that message. So now let's discuss whether or not a plateau is a good thing or a bad thing. Personally, I don't think it's such a bad thing if you're able to maintain a level of income that allows you to operate effectively. If we're talking about a plateau where you're stuck at zero and you can't even get any traction on Patreon, that's a whole different problem that you need to look at. But if you're on Patreon, you have patrons, and you're just not getting people to stick around for very long, or you're not able to attract new patrons, here's where you want to take a look at what you're doing and try to spark that growth. If you're pushing yourself and not getting growth, or if you're getting growth but you're not able to sustain it physically or creatively, then a plateau certainly could be a bad thing. Frankly, plateaus are inevitable. Because of the nature of my creative niche, there are only so many Corel Painter users who are willing or able to become my patron. Even if I branch out to Photoshop or other digital art apps, there's still a much lower ceiling for a digital artist compared to a musician or some creative niche that's appealing to the masses. At some point, I'm going to reach the limit of how many people are willing to support me. So while I can push through those plateaus in the short term, I'm eventually going to reach the limit of what I can earn on Patreon. I've accepted that, and for that reason, I don't want to put all of my effort into growing Patreon. Patreon is not my full-time job. It's just a fraction of my income. It's also tied into a workflow that promotes sales elsewhere. So while you might be disappointed by my slow growth over the last couple of years, if I overlaid a chart showing my growth in course sales, you'd see that a plateau in growth was necessary to facilitate growth elsewhere. The patrons who have been sustaining this plateau also purchase my courses, so while I didn't grow as much in 2018 and 2019, I increased the amount of money I make from my patrons outside of Patreon by producing courses. And that's not to mention that the courses I created also brought in a lot of income from non-patrons as well. So as you can see down here at the bottom of this chart, there's really not a month where I didn't lose at least one patron. Patreon turnover is natural, and as we looked at earlier, I lose patrons for a variety of reasons each month. You should expect a natural fluctuation in growth, like waves on an ocean. And if you rock the boat, don't be surprised if you make a wave. In my case, I was willing to risk losing some growth to make fulfilling benefits more manageable in the long term. What you don't want is to be losing patrons to where you're just going down and down and down until you reach zero. If that's happened, then you've really messed something up and you need to go back and look at why that happened. What did you do on that date that caused you to lose all of your patrons? And if you've made some changes, then I think you'll know. So that ought to give you some idea of how to get out of yet another plateau on your Patreon. But before I end this video, I want to address a comment that I've received quite a few times on my previous video, and that is something along the lines of 3 times 0 is still 0. And these are people referring to having 0 patrons, and even if they have 3 times the growth, they're still not making any money. The problem here is that you're getting way ahead of yourself. You need to build an audience first before you can expect anyone to support you. So let's say 1 to 3% of your audience becomes a long-term patron. Would that number be worthwhile to you? If you don't have an audience, then you're focusing on the wrong task. Sure, it would be great if you could just create a Patreon and people who have no idea who you are would seek you out and give you money. But it doesn't work that way. I have lots of videos that you can watch that explain how to build an audience, a YouTube channel, a website, pretty much everything you need to learn before you're ready to start a Patreon. It's a lot of work, but if you want to earn a decent amount of money on Patreon, then you'll have to put in the effort. I'll link you to some of those videos at the end of this video. It might also be helpful to see Patreon from the inside. So even if you're not a digital artist, you might consider joining my Patreon at patreon.com/AaronRutton to see how I post content each month. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.